Yes, Jason, welcome to this evening, the last, the last, the last interventions we will have today, this evening, and the microphone is yours. Please proceed.
Okay, well, thank you all for tuning in, whatever time it is in the world. My name's Jason Metters. I'm from the UK, and I work with David for the two charities 15 Square and Future Choices. And I'd like to do a presentation on some of the findings that we've had that have been inspired by the stories that men have shared with us. A lot of these men are people who have volunteered information whilst they are trying to find answers to some of the problems that they've been having. With the correspondence that we get looking for information, a lot of issues come to light that over the past 25 years have been kind of stockpiled. So we have 25 years worth of data, and it's only in the past, I'd say 7 or 8 months that David and I have been able to start cataloguing these 25 years worth of data from the stories of men who've written into us, and using their stories, we can start to analyze particular patterns and issues that men have been struggling with. Now, even though I'm using the men's data that people have given forward, all anonymized, of course, so there's no tracing it back to the original person. I'd like to actually use this as a platform to talk about both men and women and the psychological aspects of genital alteration. And this can also be applied to intersex people as well. So although I'm using a man's data, I don't think it's exclusively to just men. And I will go into this in the presentation. So first of all, I would like to start talking about the term success. A lot of medical practitioners and surgeons would call a successful circumcision one that is it's considered a success if there are no immediate complications from a third-party perspective. So as there's so many circumcisions that take place in younger people, not only can they not really complain, or their parents don't report the complaints that they have, as they assume, as the doctors tell them that it's safe. So this is a problem. There's no problems that are actually being recorded, but also the experiences of these boys can't really be known in the short term until the age of maturity, when it is up to them to decide as to whether or not it has been a success. Many people within the anti-circumcision movement have discovered that they've had problems later on in life. And I imagine that a high majority of these people would have been considered successful circumcisions. So in fact, the label success can only be in reference to immediate surgical appearance from the third-party perspective. So, and it simply means no obvious immediate complication. So this term success is an obvious flaw to those who encourage male circumcision, as there's never been a long-term study or a follow-up investigation into the problems that men say that they are experiencing in later life. The fact that there's been no long-term study is extremely concerning, because if circumcision didn't ever exist and someone suggested the procedure in the modern day and it was suddenly discovered, then the first port of call would be to test the efficacy in the short term, and then there would be a long-term study, and that would be to get it past an ethics review board. Now, because circumcision has been with us for so many years and it's assumed safe, and this label of success is applied to it, it means that it's bypassed all of those safety standards that are there for most other operations. So it's breaking all of the rules in the book. Some of these problems can be split into two different categories. One of them is physiological. So these may be issues with abrasion or tissue damage. And the other is psychological. And it's the psychological issues that I'd like to talk most about, really. However, as I said, there's been no long-term follow-up through these things, and there is an element of strong skepticism, not just in medical institutions and in politics, but also the public as well, when they first encounter the idea that men might be psychologically damaged. Now, the 25 years worth of data that we have cannot be ignored, because there's a consistency that the men are reporting. The same stories come about again and again and again. Now, this is not exactly something that we can definitively say circumcision causes this psychological damage. However, we can say that a certain portion of these people experience these large amount of issues. Now, this current state of research and recognition of female genital mutilation psychological damage is also difficult to determine. Whilst we may assume, because of the progressive nature that some governments are making towards trying to stop FGM, we may assume that they already know there is psychological damage. Now, that is something that we know. However, there is no definitive study that says that FGM causes this damage or FGM causes that damage. We see lots of PTSD-like issues, but there are so many factors involved that determining the exact amount of damage that can be caused psychologically, or the types of damage that people report, there's too many factors to put it into an actual study. But this doesn't mean that the information that women give can be discounted. In 2010, the Norwegian government sponsored a study into the psychological damage that women experience from FGM. It was called the Psychological, Social and Sexual Consequences of FGM, a systematic review of quantitative studies. And I'm just going to read a quote for this, because I think it's really important to understand where male genital mutilation or circumcision and the psychological damages compared to the recognition with women as well. And this is a quote from that study. We searched systematically for relevant literature in international scientific databases. In databases of international organizations that are engaged in aspects of FGM, and reference lists of relevant reviews and included studies. We included and summarized the results from 17 comparative studies with over 12,500 participants from communities where FGM is practiced. All studies compared women with FGM to women and women without FGM. The evidence base was insufficient to draw conclusions about the psychological and social consequences of FGM. Now, this goes on, but in the conclusion, it says, there is a scarcity of high quality evidence regarding the consequences of FGM. While the evidence base is insufficient to draw a causal conclusion about the consequences of FGM, our results show that there are physiological problems such as pain and reduction in sexual satisfaction. Now, this isn't to say, of course, that there aren't psychological consequences, only that the data that is provided has so many different factors involved that it makes measuring it so difficult. And this is a challenge that MGM or male circumcision will have also. There is obviously some recognition publicly that that women will be affected, and whilst the World Health Organization has an appalling track record with male circumcision, their stance on female circumcision is quite progressive. And I've taken a quote to counteract the previous one with the World Health Organization statement. They reported the immediate psychological trauma may stem from the pain, shock, and use of physical force by those performing FGM. In the long term, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and memory loss may occur. And this is from a 2005 study. A study in the practicing of African communities found that women who have undergone FGM have the same levels of PTSD as adults who have been subjected to early childhood abuse. And the majority of the women, 80% of them, suffer from affective mood or anxiety disorders. There is a risk of depressed mood, reduced social functioning, worthlessness, guilt, and even suicidal ideation. Now, I'd like to share as well with the stories that men have been giving us that all of these factors that have been expressed are found within the male population as well, independently of each other. These aren't all people who are part of the activist movement. They aren't all people who've ever really heard of circumcision affecting people before. A lot of these people are just getting in touch because they realize they haven't been told things that are starting to affect them, and they need a second opinion. I'd just like to share a quote as well, and I'm not going to say whether this is a man or a woman. I imagine a lot of you will already be familiar with the stories of both men and women. However, I think by not sharing the gender, the ambiguity shows the similarity in the stories. The end result for me, unfortunately, was like having part of your sexuality removed. It triggered a strong psychological reaction in my case, and when it dawned on me what had happened, I went into deep shock. I couldn't possibly see a way forward for myself. I was suicidal, and at this point I needed help, which is difficult for me to ask for. I was in absolute distress, the sort I'd never encountered. I was left with diminished sensitivity and was unable to facilitate an orgasm. As for personal relations, my confidence has been decimated. Now, that story, again, I'm not going to say whether it's male or female. Some people may think that they can tell. However, all of those issues, I've chosen that story because each one of those is not necessarily indicating one way or the other, because these are common experiences felt by both men and women. Another study as well, just to go back to the different literature reviews on FGM and the psychological consequences. This is a study from 2015, so relatively recently, and it's called Long-Term Health Consequences for FGM, and it's a literature review published in 2015. While findings provide an indication of adverse psychological effects for women and girls having received FGM, more studies are needed. In particular, studies that focus on the role, the cutting extent, the circumstances surrounding the cutting, and the girl's level of knowledge of what was going to take place and their relationships to the psychological outcomes. Now, that's something we agree with. There does need to be more studies with both men and women to work out whether the cultural backlash or which particular issues, whether it's the relationships with the parents that can contribute or even help people who've had psychological damage. Just anecdotally, I mean, mine and David's experience, a lot of the stories that men are sharing, there's a serious relationship between the parents, which really makes a difference as to how well certain psychological traumas are then processed, because you get a layering effect. People feel damaged or psychologically vulnerable or abused. If they are then told that all of their concerns are pointless, worthless, and that they're wrong, and the decisions made by medical institutions and parents was correct, then the psychological backlash is even stronger. So it's a compounding effect. So yes, we do believe there needs to be more research for both men and women in the psychological effects. But these are things that are only just coming to light. However, what's really important from a social perspective is that women are taken very seriously, because people can understand how this would have a psychological effect. It's a form of abuse trauma. And this is something that the general cultures, at least in the West, have had a lot of trouble with accepting. And I know the same is true within Islamic communities as well. And there's that layering again of culture and social upbringing, expectations of men not to complain. So it's a dynamic process. But the idea is, and I know that Brian Earp mentioned this yesterday, that whether or not there are studies that definitively tell people how much and to what extent certain psychological issues manifest, it doesn't matter, because the data here shows that it is happening. And the stories are similar. And regardless of whether there is some ultimate study or not, the evidence, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's not to say it's not happening just because there isn't this study, because the stories of men speak for themselves and the stories of the women speak for themselves, and they should be taken seriously as that as well. With that being said, I'd like to just go over briefly some of the statistics that we managed to gather. Now, we recognize this is a small sample size. It's 257 people, and this is over the past 2 years. But with regards to the data that we have, this is all information that is being volunteered by people writing into us without us asking any questions. So, of course, we deal with a lot more men, but not everyone wants to share their story. So this should be taken into account. And of some of these people whose stories that we have, some of them are given by parents and sometimes partners as well. So it's not always just the men that get in touch, it can be anyone. And quite often we see concerned parents or loved ones coming forward with the stories that men often don't want to share. And I can say that only a few months ago, I think it was maybe just before lockdown actually, I think in January time, a mother who was in her 50s or 60s, I assume, came forward to talk about her son and psychological damage. And her son was, I think, in his late 30s. So there's still this element of people not really wanting to share those issues, but there's still evidence that there's psychological damage. With that being said, 104 of this sample were circumcised, and 148 were intact. Of those 104 that had been circumcised, 8 of those were multiple procedures. So, I mean, that's a significant amount of botched circumcisions there as well, or repeat circumcisions. And one of them was actually intact at the start of correspondence, and at some point during correspondence, they'd gone through with the circumcision. The fact that they were still in correspondence with us, I think it shows that obviously it didn't really go as they'd hoped or planned. And then 5 other category were recorded as well. That's dorsal slit, frenuloplasty, and partial circumcision and cases of hyperspadias. So of the 104 that had been circumcised, and just as a side note, it is important to remember these are people who are getting in touch with us, so we assume there is a problem already anyway. But of the 104 that have got in touch with us, that we have data on, 55% of those reported at least one of the following psychological conditions or damage. This is abuse trauma, agoraphobia, anger, anxiety, depression, embarrassment, insomnia, loss and sensations of having lost something, OCD, PTSD, sexual dysfunction, suicidal thoughts, or other unspecified psychological issues. So that's where they told us they're having psychological problems but haven't specified where. 5% of these said that there were at least 2 from that list of the experiences, and 3% of them on top of that 5 said that they were having 3 from that list. So that might be sensations of loss, embarrassment, and sexual dysfunction. So there's a compounding effect. Others would be, for instance, suicidal thoughts and PTSD. So you can see how many of these things link into each other. The sample, and this is very interesting, and I'll tell you why in a moment, 65.5% of them were circumcised between the ages of 0 and 14. Now, 34% of those were unnecessary medical procedures. And I think this is provable. What I'm basing this on is the fact that the reason given for their circumcision is phimosis, or even in some situations, ballooning. Now, obviously, we know that ballooning is not an indication for the need of circumcision. It's a natural part of a boy's development. Not all of them experience it, I'm sure, but it's a very common experience, and it's a natural part of the separation of the prepuce from the glans. Now, the 0 to 14 age group is important because this is well within the age range where you would expect to see preputial adhesions, where the foreskin is still fused to the glans. And naturally, that is not an indication for circumcision, because there is still time for the boy to develop, and natural physiological phimosis would actually resolve itself in the majority of the cases. I know David mentioned the amount of unnecessary phimosis diagnoses that happen. In Britain, it's 7 times the expected cases of phimosis. So the incidence in which we'd expect to find it, compared to the amount of times doctors give that as a reason, the doctors use this 7 times more often. 49% of the men who got in touch reported at least one of these physical conditions or issues. Abrasion issues, balanitis, buried penis, BXO, damaged meatus, desensitivity, erectile dysfunction, extensive scarring, infection, itching sensations, loose skin from dorsal slit procedures, for instance, pain, scrotal webbing, sexual dysfunction in general, and skin bridges or skin tags. And tightness as well. So I've kind of separated and starred erectile dysfunction because of the nature of it being both psychological and physiological, depending on whether it originates from desensitivity issues. Where the service users have indicated the advice from their doctors when they've gone into detail what was told to them in the surgeries, 90% of the people had received inadequate or incorrect advice. And 10% of them had received adequate advice. And a lot of this is indicated by the fact they're even asking us the questions. The need to go to our charity a lot of the time is because they don't feel that the doctors have been very helpful, or they are having issues that they aren't warned about. And 14% of them explicitly indicated that they'd not been given information on the potential complications. This is getting better, I will say this. It is getting better within the medical establishments, at least in the UK. However, there's so much work left to do. And I think as we start to progress with the 25 years worth of data from people all over the world, by the way, this isn't just UK centric, however, the majority are, we can start to really develop some statistics which can show the faults of the medical establishments, but also the unspoken and unrecognized issues that men are going through. And that this compounds also the psychological damage that women have as well. It's a joint effort and a joint issue. And I'd just like to kind of finish on the note that, yes, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that gravity existed a long time before Newton. And we're not waiting for an ultimate study, although we welcome it, because we already have the stories of the men who come forward and say there is a problem. And I think it's something that should be taken seriously culturally and within the medical institutions. I think I've really left this right up to the end point here, so we'll probably only have a couple of minutes if anyone has any questions about the presentation. Oh,
Thank you, Jason.
I think John's speaking, but there's no sound coming on this end.
No sound?
Yeah.
Right, do you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, we hear you now.
Sorry about that. I forgot to move my headphone back in place. But yeah, I shared a few places where there's circumcisionharm.org and mendocomplain.com, and even Your Whole Baby has some testimonies about how men do speak out. And I was kind of wondering, are you sharing your guys' results?
We'd like to at some point, yes. I mean, okay. At the moment, I'm still, I mean, the presentation I've given now was topical because this is a document that I'm currently working on. So when it's ready, we'd like to get this information out there as much as possible, really. Yeah. Obviously, the findings, none of the personal data will be shared. However, this is on, we have a side project as well, which we're hoping that we can use ICASM to kind of platform too. And that is to share the stories of men who are comfortable with their personal stories being shared. And anyone who knows anyone with one of these stories can email stories@15square.org.uk. But yes, we absolutely want to get this information out there. I think that's important to for people to start recognizing the psychological damage as well as the physiological.
I also noted in the chat that Brian Earp actually wrote a paper not too long ago about the WHO stance on genital autonomy. I don't know if you saw that.
Possibly. I mean, I tune into Brian every now and again. It's good to keep on focus just by being aware of what he's writing about. Yeah. I mean, the World Health Organization are great with female genital mutilation, but I mean, there's a lot of internal corruption there as well, because obviously the two biggest donors being the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the United States government.
Haven't you heard the latest news? The USA has stopped funding the WHO.
Well, that's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is a big. I mean, I don't think they'll struggle for donations. I think that's actually going to open the opportunity for private pharmaceutical companies to carry on picking up the gap, which I think will actually lead to further corruption. But that's
no conflict of interest at all. Let's not worry about that, right?
Exactly. Well, I think the major conflict of interest, because of the circumcision culture and the money that is in pharmaceutical interests, is one of the reasons that Africa is having their health system impacted, and how the voluntary male medical circumcision program is barely voluntary. I mean, there's so many dodgy cases in that. And there's stories of people in Africa, when they hear the World Health Organization are coming, they run and hide their children. And from some of the stories that we hear from Prince Hilary Maloba's organization and the Intactivists in Africa, they've got very good reason to. And that's a personal judgment. But with their stance on the Intactivism in general, it's great for women, not so great for men.
Yeah, that's a regular conversation I often get into, comparing or equating the two.
Well, then they're not the arbiters of all things that are right, and I think on this one, like I say, the stories of men speak for themselves, and as we go on, the more stories we hope to get out, and the more data we'd love to be able to share. Yeah.
I shared one other thing in the chat that refers to something that you were talking about how doctors often use like phimosis as an excuse to cut, and lots of other bad reasons for doing it. And there's also the bad thing of forceful retraction. So there's this the study that was done on textbooks, medical textbooks and stuff like that. And actually the guy that did it is here in the LA area, close to where I live. Right. And it showed that there's several textbooks, a large percentage of them, that severely lack in detail about the male anatomy.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because obviously with the US, the health system came out a long time after the cultural circumcision started, or around the same at the start of the whole story, I suppose. But there's still a lot of issues even in Britain, because to this day, the NHS, the code that they give to people who've been circumcised, by the way, the NHS is only supposed to provide circumcision for medical reasons. That's their official stance. However, the reasons that they can give are phimosis, BXO, paraphimosis, and redundant prepuce. Not only are several, paraphimosis and phimosis conflated when there is a bit of a difference, but also the presence of balanitis. It means that you can't really draw accurate data from that. But then the fourth one, redundant prepuce, doesn't exist. That's not a medical condition. What that means is an arbitrarily long foreskin. I mean, you could say, do you have an arbitrarily long, nose? I mean, and then they suddenly perform
earlobe,
rhinoplasty. Exactly. But all of these medical terms, when they're supposed to be medical terms, are conflated, meaning that you can't ever get accurate information out of any of the statistics the NHS have ever recorded, we will never be able to do anything with that. Which is why me and David and the rest of 15 Square have been trying to put together a very slow project, but one that we intend to follow through on, to lobby the General Medical Council into accurately recording the information regarding these things. Because once people start to record properly, it'll be organic, because the data speaks for itself. That's what we've seen. The same stories come forward, the same physical problems come forward again and again. And once they're recorded properly, like, there's very little we have to do. I mean, it might take 20 years, but I like to think that an organic approach to it is still possible, but it's very difficult because of the politics involved with this. So, does anyone else have any questions?
Yes, we have a statement of Werner Andl. Werner Andl has a friend of him who has written a book in 2013 or 14. It's a collection of stories of men, women, and parents affected by male circumcision, and he's able to give some information about this. I think, and perhaps Victor wants to say something, or Werner. It's perhaps the only book containing such statements.
Brilliant.
There are no statistics, but outstanding examples of what can happen after circumcision.
That might actually be really good for, making some kind of statistical, information as well. I mean, I don't think it's all about statistics, because the personal stories are important as well. But whilst we're trying to make a difference to the medical establishments, I think they do tend to look for this holy grail of published literature, and this is where I'm saying, like, we don't really need that, because these stories are out there. But I mean, if we can start to catalogue some of the same themes and stories that come up,
it's the first step, to know what we are talking about before we make statistics. We must know what can happen.
Well, I think I'll follow that link. Thank you very much for providing that. That's.
Werner, you want to say something about this?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, in my opinion, both sides are important: the scientific side and the side of the emotions and the stories and the reports of the affected man. And in this book, there are collected, around about 77 stories of men directly affected and women indirect affected by circumcision, and also the parents of these persons.
I mean, that's great. I mean, this is what we're trying to do at the moment as well.
Yeah.
As a personal project, this isn't really anything to do with 15 Square or Future Choices. It's still in its early infancy, but my own form of intactivism. At some point, I'd like to make a paper mache penis, but with the stories that men have written on it, because I think it's controversial enough that it gets attention, and I have a few friends who both artists that have been involved, had media coverage before as well, who'd be able to help me deliver this. But I think anything we can do to get these stories out there is excellent. And I know there are published books out there, but the more volume that we have, I think the better. So every story that someone can share can help convince someone. Thank you for providing that. And I noticed as well, just as a closing statement, Daniel Strandiord, it says that your father's autopsy report described him as having a redundant prepuce. I mean, that's like, I think modern medicine has got a long way to go. I think we can all agree on this. But it's mesmerizing to me. Before I got involved with this movement, I didn't realize how backwards, and lack of objectivity that so much modern medicine still has. But yeah, thank you all for listening.
Can I just add one thing? I think when we started 25 years ago, we started because John Warren, who formed our organisation as Norm UK, read the book The Joy of Uncircumcising by Jim Bigelow. And that contains stories in at the side of the thing. And I think that was the book that really started the movement. Certainly it was our start. And most men couldn't read more than about 2 pages of the stories before they had to put it down. And it was one of those things that they could relate to, but they couldn't read the whole thing. They had to keep dipping into it and putting it down because it was too traumatic. Well, so I think that was one of the first.
It's interesting. I mean, there are some of the stories from 15 Square on our website as well under psychological damage. So it's great that these things are popping up all over the place, because hopefully we can start to do something with all of these stories and share, press releases about, with reference to psychological damage. I've noticed one question here as well, the absence of evidence, unspoken, unrecognized issues. Do you have any hypothesis why this is so? I think that there's just been a lack of interest in the issues that men have a lot of the time. I think far fewer men who have got problems will complain about the problems. When they do, there's far less sympathy. And the fact that a lot of people are okay after it as well means that automatically people are dismissive. And no one wants to touch the issue as well, because apart from anything, the political side of things. But I mean, I know until recently, a lot of the people in this movement have been ridiculed. They share these stories, they share their experiences, and they're put on trial. And I think that's a problem. Like, when someone says they have psychological damage, you take them seriously. That's the first step. You might not necessarily fully agree or understand, but the first step is to try and understand where they're coming from. And in doing so, I got into this movement simply because I heard the stories people were saying, and it shocked me. So that's my hypothesis. And I know in England as well, there is an element of classism surrounding circumcision. It used to be an aristocratic thing to do. Because back in early 1900s and then on a bit, and previous to this as well, it was a luxury. It meant that you had expendable income. If you could afford to have a doctor circumcise your child, it meant that you had excess money, and there was an element of class structure to it as well. And then all of the things with hygiene and the politics come into it too.
Victor has raised his hand.
Thank you very much, Jason. And I would like to say that I'm very grateful for this work you're doing, because you're putting into the center of your work and the perspectives of affected men. And I think a very important point is the question of respect and empathy. The whole issue is about respect and empathy, and I think we're on a good way on doing this, because the whole world is talking about that. For example, the campaigns Me Too, they're also about respect and empathy, and people should learn that there are more aspects of that. For example, these men talking about their problems, and if they get if they're not heard and if they're ridiculed, we see how far the way is still to go.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, these are fundamental.
And we must also demand that we're getting heard. We're making progress here in Germany in our network when we go this way.
Yes.
Because the words of respect and empathy are very much used by the other side. They demand respect for hurting children. They demand respect for what they do to others, and we asked for respect for what was done to us. That's a big difference. Whom you're putting your attention, your empathy to. Thank you very much, and I was very impressed by last year's BBC series, and I'm sure you did a lot of work that this came true, and that people heard so much about what men experience. Thank you.
No, thank you for the comments. Yeah, I think that's a fundamental, and you know, with regards to respect and empathy, you know, these are very easy to give people. And I always respect the opposition in the fact that I think that most parents don't think they're doing any harm. They don't want to do any harm. And that's the respect I give them. But I think it needs to be reciprocal, and understand that there are cases where that does happen. So yeah, thank you all for listening to me for so long. I've definitely gone over a little bit, but I'm so glad there's not an entire slot afterwards. I believe there was someone else to speak during this slot though, am I wrong? For 5 minutes?
Yes, we have a little intervention, but we want to make sure that we don't have any question concerning your expose. It seems this is the case.
Okay. Well, thank you all for listening.
Thank you for your expose.